What happens when betrayal pushes a man to the brink? Watch as the lines between justice and revenge blur in this gripping tale of a violent confrontation, shocking revelations, and a man's descent into chaos. Mr. Dugan thought he was coming home to a quiet evening, but instead he finds himself caught in a whirlwind of violence, police, and a wife's infidelity. The night was eerily silent, the kind of darkness that feels thick enough to swallow the world whole. In the distance, the faint hum of a motorcycle's engine broke the stillness. A lone rider, cloaked in black, approached a quiet suburban street. His face hidden by a helmet, he was just another shadow, blending into the night. The house he was headed toward looked peaceful on the outside windows slightly lit, a home that should have been a sanctuary. But tonight, it would become a battleground. The rider parked his motorcycle a few houses down, away from prying eyes. He wasn't in a hurry. Patience was key. He had prepared for this moment for weeks. Every move, every decision was calculated. He checked his watch. Inside, the house was silent, save for the faint sound of running water. The shower. The timing was perfect. The rider took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around a large, heavy bag. There was no turning back now. He made his way to the house, walking silently in the shadows, each step bringing him closer to the confrontation he'd been planning. Inside, Daniel, his target, was oblivious, unaware that his life was about to change forever. With one last glance toward the street, the rider moved closer, slipping into the darkness at the edge of the porch. He knew the man inside his betrayal had gone too far. It wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was justice in its purest, most brutal form. The man would pay for his actions, for the life he'd ruined. The rider was ready. The moment had arrived. Inside, Daniel stood under the warm, soothing water of the shower, the day's stresses fading away with each passing second. He had no idea that his life was about to be violently altered. The first strike hit without warning, a crushing blow to his kneecaps. The pain was immediate and sharp, sending Daniel crashing to the floor, gasping for air. But there was no time to process the shock. The rider was already on top of him, moving with swift, practiced precision. A second hit landed, this time to his ribs, a sound like cracking wood reverberating through the bathroom. Daniel's body screamed in agony, but he couldn't defend himself. His muscles locked up in shock, his limbs too slow to react. The attack wasn't haphazard. Each blow was deliberate, calculated. It wasn't just about hurting Daniel, it was about making him feel every ounce of the pain he had caused. Bone broke under the weight of the assault, each strike seeming to echo through the walls, loud enough to shake the very foundation of the house. The rider wasn't just doing this out of anger, he was methodically dismantling Daniel, both physically and emotionally. As the assault continued, Daniel's consciousness began to blur. His breaths were shallow, his vision fading. He knew he couldn't win this fight. His body was crumbling under the weight of the rider's brutality. The attacker's cold, methodical movements made it clear there was no mercy here, no reprieve. Daniel had crossed a line, and now, the price was being paid in full. The rider didn't care about the pain, the screams, or the consequences. All that mattered was delivering justice, and in that moment it felt complete. The headlights of Jack Dugan's truck cut through the quiet night as he turned onto his street. The familiar sight of his neighborhood should have brought him a sense of comfort, but tonight, something felt different. The usual tranquility was replaced by a strange unease creeping into his chest. When he saw the police cars parked outside his house, his heart skipped a beat. As Jack pulled his truck to a stop, confusion flooded his mind. He quickly jumped out and approached the officers, his thoughts racing. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice shaking with panic. One of the officers looked at him with a hard expression, but it wasn't the look of a man who had good news. "Sir, you need to step back," the officer said, trying to keep his distance. Jack's eyes darted to the front door, where Anne was standing, her hands trembling as she wept. But it wasn't just her, there was someone else lying on the ground. He couldn't quite make out the figure from where he stood, but it didn't take long to realize who it was. Daniel. His worst nightmare had come to life. Daniel, his wife's lover, was sprawled on the doorstep, blood staining the concrete. Jack's stomach churned. His wife, his home, everything was falling apart. What had happened here? Why was Anne standing there, crying? His feet felt like they were glued to the pavement as he struggled to comprehend the situation. The officers began to move toward him, one of them placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sir, we need to speak with you." But Jack couldn't tear his eyes away from the gruesome scene. His mind was racing. What had Anne done? What had happened to Daniel? He had so many questions, yet his mind couldn't process them fast enough. One thing was clear: his life, his marriage, everything was spiraling out of control in a way he couldn't have predicted. And now, he was being pulled into something far darker than he ever expected. As Jack stood in the midst of the chaos, his mind was spinning. The once innocent life he thought he had with Anne had been shattered beyond recognition. But even as the officers surrounded him, trying to make sense of the situation, it was Anne's voice that cut through the tension. I didn't mean for this to happen, Jack," she sobbed, barely able to form words through the tears. She fell to her knees beside Daniel, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his bloodied face. Jack stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept the reality in front of him. What did you do?" he whispered, the words heavy with disbelief. Anne's eyes met his for the first time, and in that moment, Jack saw something that made his blood run cold. She wasn't just afraid of the situation. No, it was the guilt, the undeniable guilt of what she had done. The truth spilled out between her sobs, slowly at first, as if she could barely bring herself to say the words. I was having an affair with him," she choked out, nodding toward Daniel's motionless body. "I didn't want it to get this far, but I couldn't stop myself. It wasn't supposed to end like this." The words hit Jack like a slap to the face. His heart sank into his stomach as the weight of her confession washed over him. His wife, his Anne, had been sleeping with another man. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could, and for a moment Jack couldn't breathe. His knees threatened to buckle as his world crumbled around him. As Anne continued to cry, Jack felt a strange mixture of emotions: rage, sorrow, confusion, but above all, an overwhelming sense of disbelief. How could this be happening? He had trusted her. They had built a life together, or so he thought. And now, everything was shattered. The police officers were talking to Anne now, trying to gather her statement, but Jack couldn't focus on them. His mind was consumed with the painful truth that his wife had betrayed him in the most devastating way possible. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal, and he would never be able to look at her the same way again. And as for Daniel, the man who had dared to cross the line with his wife, Jack was torn between hatred and pity. But one thing was clear: there would be no going back from this. The air around Jack was thick with tension. His wife, Anne, was sobbing uncontrollably on the steps, her body shaking with the weight of her confession. Daniel lay motionless on the ground, blood staining the concrete, and Jack was frozen in disbelief. But the situation was only just beginning to unfold. As the police officers moved in, Jack could feel the heat of their scrutiny. Detective Morris, a seasoned officer with sharp eyes, approached him. "Mr. Dugan, we need to ask you some questions," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Jack tried to shake off the fog of shock that had settled over him. He could barely process the words coming from the detective's mouth. "What happened here?" Jack asked, his voice rising with a mix of fear and anger. "Why is Daniel lying there like that?" Detective Morris didn't answer immediately, instead motioning to the officers to begin securing the area. "We'll need your full cooperation, Mr. Dugan. The situation is more complicated than you think." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jack's mind raced. He had never been in a situation like this before. Everything about the scene screamed chaos: Anne's affair, the brutal attack on Daniel, and now the police involvement. Jack couldn't make sense of it. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the overwhelming sense of guilt and confusion kept him silent. As the detectives began asking questions, Jack's emotions boiled over. He was no longer just a man caught in the middle of a nightmare. He was being interrogated, treated like a suspect in the very violence that had unfolded outside his own home. He tried to keep his composure, but every question from the police felt like an accusation. "I didn't do this," he protested, but no one seemed to be listening. All their attention was on the bloodied body of Daniel and the obvious tension between Jack and his wife. The detective's eyes were sharp as he looked Jack over. "We have a lot of questions, Mr. Dugan. You were the last person seen coming home. Can anyone vouch for your whereabouts?" The question hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had no alibi. And with the brutal assault on Daniel fresh in everyone's minds, the police were beginning to suspect the worst. Jack's mind whirled. Could they think he had done this? Could they really believe that he would attack a man in such a brutal manner? He had been angry, yes, but this? This was something else entirely. The world around him felt like it was spinning out of control, and Jack was powerless to stop it. As the police continued to question Jack, the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing minute. He was a man torn between fury and confusion, his emotions a storm that he couldn't calm. But then, a shift occurred that caught him off guard. Anne, who had been sobbing uncontrollably just moments ago, stood up suddenly. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, hardened with an emotion Jack couldn't quite place. She turned toward the detective and spoke in a voice that made Jack's blood run cold. I don't know what happened," she said, her voice cracking. "But Jack had nothing to do with this. He came home and found us like this. He didn't hurt Daniel." Her words, though meant to protect him, only added to the confusion. They painted her as the potential source of this violence, the one who had triggered everything. Jack's heart sank as he processed what Anne was implying. Was she protecting him? Or was this some desperate attempt to shift blame away from herself? Either way, Jack knew that his truth was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The detectives exchanged glances, and Detective Morris stepped forward again. "We'll need you to stay put, Mr. Dugan, and we'll need to speak with your wife as well. We have a lot to unpack here, and it's not all adding up." Jack watched Anne carefully. The look in her eyes was something he couldn't understand. Was she truly defending him, or was she trying to protect herself? Could she even comprehend the severity of what was happening? His mind was spinning, and every question he asked himself only seemed to lead to more uncertainty. As the detectives moved to question Anne, Jack was left standing on the edge of this emotional abyss. His wife had betrayed him in the worst possible way, yet she was trying to save him from a situation that neither of them had any control over. What did that mean? Could he trust her? Could anyone trust anyone in this mess? Jack knew one thing for sure: the situation had escalated far beyond what he could have ever imagined. What started as a discovery of betrayal was now a tangled web of violence, confusion, and lies. And with the police looking at him as a suspect, the stakes had never been higher. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, the walls a dull gray that seemed to echo the dismal reality of Jack Dugan's situation. He had been sitting there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of the nightmarish chain of events that had led him here. His mind kept flashing back to the moment he found Anne crying over Daniel's body, the shock of her confession still fresh in his mind. But now it wasn't just the emotional weight that was crushing him, it was the growing sense that he was being painted as the villain in this twisted drama. Detective Morris entered the room, followed by another officer, a young man with a serious expression. Jack barely looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and confusion. His mind was a fog, filled with anger, disbelief, and regret. How had everything escalated so quickly? It felt like the world had turned on him in an instant. "We have enough to take you in," Mr. Dugan, Morris said flatly, his eyes scanning the file in his hand. "You're being arrested for aggravated assault, and at this point, we're also looking into potential charges of attempted murder." The words hit Jack like a ton of bricks. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. "Attempted murder," Jack repeated, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I didn't do this. I wasn't the one who attacked Daniel." Morris looked at him, his expression unreadable. "We don't know what happened exactly, but you were the first one at the scene. Your wife's lover is lying in a pool of blood outside your house, and you were nowhere to be found until the officers arrived." The detective's tone was firm, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Jack feel like a pawn in a game far beyond his understanding. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the walls closing in, suffocating him with every word that came out of the detective's mouth. He had been blindsided by Anne's affair, but now he was being swept up in something much darker. Was he really being blamed for this? Was the assault on Daniel being pinned on him simply because he was the one who had discovered the affair? But there was more to it than that. The police had found the weapon. A blunt object, most likely used to deliver the blows that had broken Daniel's bones, was linked to Jack. It wasn't in his possession, but it didn't matter. The circumstances, the timing, everything was working against him. The police had their suspicions, and no matter how much Jack tried to explain, they weren't willing to listen. As the officers placed him in handcuffs, the weight of his situation finally hit him. He was being arrested for a crime he didn't commit, and the chances of clearing his name seemed slimmer by the minute. His entire life had unraveled, and there was no telling how deep the hole had gotten. Was he destined to be the scapegoat in a tragedy that no one truly understood? The days following Jack's arrest were a blur. His once orderly life had been completely upended, replaced by a relentless stream of police interviews, legal consultations, and endless questions. The world outside his jail cell felt like a distant memory. His house, his home, the place where he'd built a life with Anne, it all seemed so far away now, as if it had belonged to someone else entirely. But it wasn't just the legal battles that weighed on Jack's mind, it was the painful realization that his marriage was beyond repair. Anne had been the one to betray him, but now she was standing by him, making statements to the police that only seemed to deepen the mystery. Was she trying to protect him? Or was she trying to protect herself from the consequences of her own actions? Jack didn't know what to believe anymore. One day, Anne visited him at the police station, her face pale, her eyes swollen from days of crying. She sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly together, as if to steady herself. Jack could barely look at her. He didn't know if he still loved her, or if the woman sitting across from him was someone he could never trust again. "I told them it wasn't you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told them everything. I told them you came home to find Daniel, and you didn't do this." Jack's heart twisted in his chest, but the words felt hollow. "But they still think it was me," he replied, his voice laced with bitterness. "They have the evidence, Anne. They think I attacked him." Anne looked at him, her eyes filled with guilt. "I never wanted this. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I thought maybe you wouldn't find out. But now, look at what's happened." Jack swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising flood of anger and betrayal that threatened to consume him. "What happened between us, Anne? How did we get here?" Anne's eyes filled with tears again as she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know, Jack. I was lonely. I was confused. And Daniel, he made me feel alive again. But I didn't mean for it to end this way. I never thought he'd be hurt." Jack's fists clenched involuntarily as the weight of her words hit him. She had never really thought about the consequences, had she? It had always been about what she wanted, what she needed, and now both their lives were falling apart because of her choices. The truth was staring Jack in the face. Anne's infidelity, her betrayal, it had set all of this in motion. And now, as he sat in this sterile room surrounded by officers and lawyers, Jack couldn't help but wonder if he would ever get his life back. Would he ever be able to forgive Anne? Would he ever be free from the nightmare that had consumed everything he had once held dear? Jack had spent days in the dark, his mind churning with thoughts of revenge, betrayal, and his twisted fate. He had gone over every detail of that night, questioning himself, his choices, and his marriage. But just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, a shocking twist sent the entire situation spiraling into even deeper chaos. It came in the form of a phone call, one that Jack never saw coming. Detective Morris, the officer who had been interrogating him, was on the other end. "Mr. Dugan, we found something." The detective's voice crackled through the phone. "We need you to come down to the station immediately." Jack's heart raced. Had they found new evidence? Had they uncovered something that would prove his innocence? Or worse, had they found something that would make his situation even more dire? When Jack arrived at the police station, he was led into an interrogation room where Morris was already waiting. The detective's eyes were colder than usual, his face unreadable. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his voice tense. Morris leaned forward, placing a small file in front of Jack. "We've been going through the evidence, and something doesn't add up. We've discovered that Daniel, your wife's lover, had been involved in something much more dangerous than we initially thought." Jack's pulse quickened as he looked down at the file. It was a record of Daniel's past, one that Jack hadn't been aware of. There were criminal connections, a history of violence, and ties to underground organizations that Jack never could have imagined. As the detective laid out the details, Jack's mind raced. Was Daniel the true culprit in all of this? Had his affair with Anne been a cover for something much darker? But the real bombshell came when Morris dropped the final piece of information. "We also found out that Daniel was planning something involving you, Mr. Dugan. We don't know the full extent of it yet, but it looks like he may have had a plan to get you out of the picture, one way or another." Jack's stomach turned as he processed the revelation. For the first time, the suspicion that had been gnawing at him began to make sense. Daniel had been playing a dangerous game, one that went far beyond a simple affair. And now Jack realized he was at the center of it all, caught in a web of lies, betrayal, and violence. The detective's eyes softened slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "We need you to help us with this, Mr. Dugan. If you cooperate, we can work together to get to the bottom of what really happened." Jack felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and confusion. The entire foundation of his world had been shaken, and now he was left with more questions than answers. Had his wife's affair been part of a larger scheme? Was he really the victim? Or had he simply been another pawn in Daniel's dangerous game? The only thing Jack knew for sure was that his life would never be the same again. As Jack sat in the quiet of his prison cell, the weight of everything that had happened finally settled in. The legal proceedings had dragged on, and with each passing day, the walls seemed to close in a little more. But despite the charges of aggravated assault and attempted murder hanging over his head, Jack felt a strange sense of clarity. He was no longer the man he once was. His life had been irreparably altered, but now he understood the true nature of the forces at play. The trial was fast approaching, and Jack had to come to terms with the fact that his marriage, his life, and his future were all on the line. He thought of Anne, her tear-streaked face, her desperate attempts to defend him, and the truth that had slowly revealed itself. She had been unfaithful, yes, but she had also been entangled in something far more sinister than either of them could have imagined. Was she truly a victim in all of this, or was she just another player in a twisted game of manipulation? The court proceedings were intense, each side presenting their case with fervor. Jack's defense team argued that he had acted out of emotional turmoil, a man driven to violence by the betrayal of his wife. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of cold, calculated brutality, claiming that Jack had taken matters into his own hands, using violence to seek revenge on the man who had been with his wife. In the midst of the trial, Jack sat in the courtroom, his eyes fixed on Anne. She was there, too, a mere shadow of the woman he had once loved. Her presence only deepened the ache in his chest. She had betrayed him not just in the affair, but in the way she had been manipulated by forces she had never truly understood. Jack realized that he wasn't the only one who had been a victim. They both had been caught in the crossfire of lies and deception. But even as Jack grappled with the consequences of his actions, a final twist awaited him. The truth about Daniel's connections to the criminal world became clearer, and the prosecution's case began to crumble. The evidence of Daniel's past was too damning to ignore, and soon it became clear that Jack had not been the aggressor in this situation. He had been set up. Daniel had been the one pulling the strings all along. In the end, the jury deliberated and reached a verdict. Jack was acquitted of the charges, but the victory felt hollow. The damage had been done. His life was forever changed, and no legal ruling could undo the scars that would remain. As he walked out of the courthouse, the world outside felt foreign. Jack was free, but the price he had paid for that freedom was one he would never fully escape. Thanks for watching. If you've been captivated by this intense journey of betrayal and redemption, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to stay updated with all our future videos. See you next time.